it's clinically insignificant. So while it might be statistically significant, it's not clinically significant. Oh, amen. And maybe, Dr. Stanfield, maybe you don't understand how much money it takes to study these things. Hi, Dr. Eric Westman with another Dr. Westman Reacts. I was sent a video called The 3 Studies Just Confirmed the Best Diet by Dr. Brad Stanfield. Let's see what he has to say.
3 studies, all published this year, have independently confirmed the best diet for human health, and we'll go through each study step by step. Now, before we begin, I do want to acknowledge that diet is a very personal decision. For example, some people swear by the carnivore diet, others the vegan diet. What matters, though, is that you follow a diet that works for you, that makes you feel energized, protects your heart, maximizes your muscle strength, and maintains a healthy weight. I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm just reporting on these 3 studies so that you've got more information to make your own health choices. The first study was published in the Journal of Medicine, so a very high-ranking journal, and as we go through this study, I want you to be skeptical. Why should we believe this trial? It compared low-carbohydrate diets to low-fat diets, and it's a prospective cohort study. It starts by acknowledging that there's conflicting information, where some randomized controlled trials suggest more cardiovascular benefits from a low-carbohydrate diet than a low-fat diet, but yet a recent meta-analysis concluded that there's potentially undesirable effects from a low-carbohydrate diet with respect to total and all-cause death rates. However, the long-term effects of the low-carbohydrate diet compared to the low-fat diet on age-related health outcomes remains less studied. Which brings us to this trial, which aims to identify the associations between each dietary pattern with total and all-cause death rates. It enrolls people between the age of 50 to 71 years old in the United States, and it involved a total of over 371,000 participants. And all participants completed a food questionnaire each year, so this is an observational study. It's not a randomized controlled trial. It's simply observing these participants to see if their diet choices affect their overall lifespan. And it followed these participants up for 23 years. So the strengths of this study is that it's a massive study involving a lot of participants and over a significant time frame. And when we have a look at the results, we can see that those participants that followed the low-carbohydrate diet, they seem to have increased rates of death. And the more rigorously that people stuck to the low-carbohydrate diet, the higher their death rates, and we can see a clear trend.
I like his approach, reading the abstract and pointing out that it's not a randomized trial, so it's association. Association doesn't mean causation. You should know that by now, watching videos on this. So that you can't really prove anything in a association kind of study like this. To really prove something, you would do a prospective study or isolate out that one factor, and randomized trials are one way to do that, to limit bias and to find out what one factor can do. So, of course, the major limitation of these studies is the method with which they describe the food intake. So imagine a food frequency questionnaire is imagine you being asked what you ate. And it's sometimes it's over the last week, over the last month, over the last year. So, for example, imagine you had a list of probably 100 different items. How many times in the last week have you had a hamburger? How many times have you had a steak? How many times have you had an apple? This is the kind of information that a food frequency questionnaire generates. And that's the data in a data set that then is used to correlate with some outcome of death and dying or health issue. And the problem with these studies is that the accuracy of this information is of some question. If someone asked you, how many times have you had a Snickers bar, or something that you're thought, or that other people think is unhealthy, you may be less apt to endorse the idea that you had candy bar and how often you had it, how many alcoholic drinks, etc. So you're taking someone's self-reported information of what they're having. That's a big flaw in these kinds of studies. In general, in randomized controlled trials, or it doesn't have to be a randomized trial, you could do a better food information calculation and even do a biologic measure that has to do with the food intake. And in our controlled trials, we found that the serum triglyceride correlated really well with the amount of carbohydrate that people were taking in. And in a keto type of diet study, you can actually measure ketosis. We measure it in the urine in several of our studies. It's a valid measure. So there was a biologic confirmation that someone was having super low carb intake. And of course, that's rarely done in these types of studies. It wasn't done in this one. So the information is dubious, questionable, the food information. And now, let's say the assessment of health outcomes, death and dying and all, of course, that has its own issues with quality of the information that you get. And typically when the information is murky like this, you don't find correlations. You don't find big correlations. And here they didn't. I mean, so even the hazard ratio for low-carb diet for death was 1.06 or 1.28, which means that it's almost nothing. It's clinically insignificant. So while it might be statistically significant, it's not clinically significant. This is a concept that really has been generated since the Austin-Bradford-Hill criteria of causation. It was kind of brought up again in clinical epidemiology and evidence-based medicine, so that when you're looking at odds ratios or hazard ratios at a risk in a cohort study, you want something to be strongly associated. And if it's under, say, a level of 2 or 1.5, or in this case 1.2, it's pretty much it's insignificant in terms of other studies validating this kind of outcome. Smoking, there's been no randomized trial of smoking in lung cancer, but the association was 12-1 for high smokers in lung cancer. This is 1.28-1. 12-1, 1.8-1. So yes, you can find out things if the association is really, really high. But in this case, it's not. And I would say that this is not a clinically significant finding.
So please don't shoot the messenger, I'm simply reporting on these findings. If we compare that to the low-fat diet, we can see a clear trend of decreasing death rates. So the more that the participants stuck to a low-fat diet, we can see that they had lower overall death rates. The same findings were found for heart disease, where participants that stuck to the low-carbohydrate diet, they had increased rates of cardiovascular death. In contrast, those that...
Again, the numbers themselves are so small that they are very unlikely to be able to be replicated in other studies. I remember talking to experts in nutritional epidemiology, and what they say is, well, these are the highest kinds of odds ratios we see. Well, that's just not good enough. I'm sorry. So the statistical significance is different than clinical significance and clinical relevance.
Those that ate a low-fat diet, they had lower rates of total cardiovascular death. The same was found for cancer, where the low-carbohydrate diets had increased rates of cancer deaths. Whereas...
Again, if you look carefully, that it's 1.1, 1.4, these are way below any threshold you would say that is clinically relevant.
The low-fat diet had lower rates of cancer deaths. If we move to the discussion where they did further analysis, they say that when they replaced low-quality carbohydrates and saturated fats with plant-based proteins, that was associated with an even lower chance of death rates. These results suggest that a healthy, low-fat diet with minimal saturated fat intake would be an effective dietary strategy for healthy aging middle-aged and older people. What I take away from this large observational study is that it provides more proof that we want to lower low-quality carbohydrate intake. We want to cut out sugary foods and processed grains such as white bread. We also want to reduce saturated fat intake, and these findings are in line with a previous Cochrane review. On the point of protein, a physiological hallmark during aging is a decline in skeletal muscle mass and function, known as sarcopenia, which may increase morbidity and death rates and the risks of age-related chronic disease. Therefore, adequate protein intake is recommended for middle-aged and older people to counteract sarcopenia, and that's why in the clinic I often suggest to my patients that they need to significantly increase their protein intake. And in this observational study, they observed more evident reverse associations with death rates when people replaced low-quality carbohydrates and saturated fats with plant protein rather than animal protein. The discussion goes on to emphasize that we need to move away from a typical Western diet or move away from the standard American diet. The overall takeaway is that we want to substitute low-quality carbohydrates and saturated fats and replace them with high-quality protein. The strengths of this study is that it was massive. It involved over 370,000 participants, and it was over a long time frame, so 23 years. We can also see clear trends, but the weaknesses of this study is that it's an observational trial, so we can't fully adjust for all of the other confounding factors. Which brings us to the second.
I think that was a pretty good review. The conclusion about saturated fats has to be couched in the new knowledge about the diets that sufficiently lower carbohydrates to, say, under a 10% level. You actually are burning more saturated fat, and there's less saturated fat in the blood because you're burning it, even though you're eating more fat. So I'm afraid we're asking a study to shed light on people that aren't in the study. I mean, I can't imagine that there are a lot of people in a keto diet based on their categorization of things in that study. And so I think that's a function of we've been taught to limit saturated fat for so long. You're going to look for that in a study, and you're going to find a very small association if you look for it. So many other confounders, and there's so many studies that have been like this, kind of confirming what everyone knows to be true, and I'm just not convinced. I think you can see what you want to see in these kinds of studies, and the associations are super small.
Second study that was published in the British Medical Journal. It's a systematic review and meta-analysis, so a much higher level of evidence compared to that first observational trial. It starts by acknowledging that although dietary guidelines have suggested that a number of dietary programs might reduce the risk of major cardiovascular events, they have typically relied on surrogate outcomes or low to very low certainty evidence from non-randomized study designs. And to date, there's a lack of meta-analyses that have systematically summarized the randomized controlled trials to compare the impact of structured dietary programs on death rates and major cardiovascular events. So this meta-analysis only included randomized controlled trials of adults at an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. Eligible studies had to have gone for at least 9 months. But one of the weaknesses of this study is that they couldn't do a macronutrient composition analysis because there weren't enough studies that looked at low carbohydrate diets. So a quick tangent to address the carnivore and keto influences. You've made a lot of money selling courses and dietary supplements. Please use some of that money to fund a large randomized controlled study looking at your particular diet and comparing it to, say, for example, a Mediterranean diet, looking over a 5-year period to see what the effect of people following your diet has on cardiovascular disease. Coming back to the analysis, it found 40 eligible trials involving over 35,000 participants. The average follow-up was 3 years, and on assessing the quality of these trials, they judged 13 to be low risk of bias and 27 to be at high risk of bias. And when we have a look at the summary, we can see that the Mediterranean diet and the low-fat diets were the clear winners in terms of reducing all-cause death rates. The analysis goes on to say that these results established with moderate certainty evidence an absolute risk reduction in mortality rates that is attributable to the Mediterranean diet and the low-fat dietary programs. Overall then, this meta-analysis has similar themes to the previous observational study that we went through, where we want to try and reduce low-quality carbohydrates and reduce saturated fats and replace them with protein. The final study that we'll go through is a narrative review, and then I'll share the diet that I personally follow. The review discusses the Mediterranean diet and how it limits or eliminates many of the culprits in the standard American diet that drive cardiovascular disease, specifically that we want to try and reduce saturated fats and highly processed refined grains and sugars. The review then shifts its focus to the keto and other very low carbohydrate diets, and it says that these diets they have been promoted for their effects on weight loss, improvement in insulin resistance, and blood sugar level control. However, this diet can also promote increases in LDL cholesterol, particularly in a subset of individuals who are hyper-responsive. This has limited the enthusiasm of many medical professional societies from endorsing its use. Evidence of this comes from a recent meta-analysis that found that the ketogenic diet it conferred unfavorable effects to LDL cholesterol and ApoB. These potential deleterious effects on lipids needs to be considered carefully before initiating a ketogenic diet. However,
well, if you've heard me speak about looking at cholesterol levels, you'll know that there's an old way and a new way to look at the cholesterol profile, the lipid profile. The total in LDL cholesterol, ApoB, being a function of LDL, is the old way. And there's a lot of concern, right? But what about the new way, the triglyceride and HDL? It's called metabolic syndrome. So a low-carb diet addresses cardiometabolic risk in a different way. It's like there are different drugs for high blood pressure. One of them might be an ACE inhibitor. One of them might be a calcium channel blocker. The calcium blocker drugs don't say the ACE inhibitor drugs don't work, or they're wrong. So the focus only on an LDL cholesterol is a bit, how should I say, old-fashioned. You want to look at triglyceride and HDL. And I just came from a clinic where the HDL levels were super high. I went to the Mayo Clinic statin decision aid tool and typed in all the information and factors that the Mayo Clinic asks for, and looked at the risk that someone might have and the benefit that they might be on for a statin. And actually, when you look at a low-carb diet with all of these kinds of cardiometabolic parameters, it actually looks good because it lowers the triglyceride, raises the HDL, it lowers the abdominal circumference, reduces the BMI and the weight. It's really this function of the same thing, and the blood pressure and the blood sugar all at the same time. So if you're only going to focus on an LDL, that's a bit narrow and a bit old-fashioned, and yet you're going to see papers and organizations that focus on that. There's some organizations that were started on the premise of a low-fat diet being the best thing. If they started on the premise of a low-fat diet, they're probably not going to ever like a high-fat diet. Endorse it unless it's a scientific organization that really has to change based on the science. Most of these are not, and they're really kind of generated by the members and what seems popular at the time. So don't worry so much about this LDL thing.
But theoretically, a plant-based ketogenic diet that is low in saturated fats may limit some of these adverse consequences, but there are no trials examining this yet, and again, I'm reiterating my call here to the keto and carnivore communities. We need you to fund these trials. The narrative review concludes that the
amen. And maybe, Dr. Stanfield, maybe you don't understand how much money it takes to study these things. And it turns out that a company had to study the diet in terms of diabetes reversal. That's Virta Health. And so now we're in a conundrum where you don't believe the study because a company did it. Because nobody else would fund it. So, you're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. So, amen. We need to have more clinical trials looking at a wide range across the whole macronutrient range in terms of cardiovascular risk. And I'm still wondering how he's going to define Mediterranean diet, because there are many different versions of Mediterranean. And the joke is that it just means more olive oil, but it's more complicated than that. In some parts of the Mediterranean basin, they have lots of butter, and the definition of it is not super clear. But the idea of a plant-based keto diet came out of the blue, which I'm not sure that's a great idea. But again, we're talking about a metabolism. Keto means fat burning. It doesn't matter so much to me what's on the plate that you're eating and drinking. I want to know what's going on inside, what the metabolism is showing.
It's that the Mediterranean diet remains one of the most effective and recommended balanced diets for cardiovascular health promotion. In summary, all three of these studies suggest reducing low-quality carbohydrates and saturated fats and replace those with high-quality proteins. At the end of the day though, it's your health, your decision. Diets are incredibly personal. I wanted to report on these studies so that you've got more information when you're making your own health decisions. I am not here to convince you of anything. Whatever you decide to do with your own health is your decision. Personally, I follow a Mediterranean diet. That's the diet that works for me.
I liked the approach of reviewing the studies and knowing the difference between observational studies and randomized control trials, and then the exhortation for the studies to be done on these diets actually may not be the best thing for the keto community to study the keto diet. We need independent people to do it. Maybe an NIH group or fully funded for doing something else will do the research on it. There are some people who are so much promoters of a certain approach, they wouldn't be trusted if the results were there. You always want to have independent validation. And then, of course, the Virta Health doing their own diabetes reversal study is criticized because it's the company that did it, but it's the best diabetes reversal study using lifestyle that I'm aware of. It's a fantastic study showing the effect of a keto diet on diabetes reversal. So in general, I think it's a good approach. I'm still not sure what a Mediterranean diet truly is. There's so many different versions of it. I'm not so down on saturated fat as the old paradigm folks are, for the reason that you're burning it and you're able to process the fat that you eat in a way that you couldn't before when you were eating carbs. And then we actually store saturated fat in our bodies to use for energy later. Everybody becomes a fat burner if you don't eat for 2 days. That's just what we store as energy in our body is fat. So I'm not compelled to think that it's going to be a bad thing in the end. But we need more research, of course. That's the standard line of any researcher. But in general, I think I like the approach. It's Keto Docs approved. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, and check out adaptyourlifeacademy.com.